Hi, my name is Bob Tribe, and welcome to Valley to Vietnam. Valley to Vietnam is a joint effort between the Sacramento Public Library and the Vietnam Veterans of America Chapter 500. It is our intent to trace the arc of experience between Sacramento and Vietnam for our local Vietnam vets. Our guest today is Bob Pacholik, and he was in the United States Army, served a double tour, 2 years in Vietnam. So Bob, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Bob, you were born in Chicago.
Yep, South Side.
1945. And did you hang out with any of the Italian gangsters there?
No.
Okay.
It was an ethnic neighborhood, so the Poles and the Germans and the Italians and the Czechs all stayed with their own clan.
It's just places like Chicago and New York have such character. I'm fascinated by those sort of places. Your father was a tool design engineer. Your mother was a florist.
Correct, right.
And your father did various engineering projects.
Yeah, at one point he did the diesel engines for the landing craft of World War II.
No.
He designed the specific engines that went into the Higgins boats.
Oh, I remember Higgins boats.
And he was draft deferred 7 times during the war because he was a high skill.
So you grew up in south side of Chicago. You went to Catholic schools.
Yes, I did. Both grade school and high school, and I had an absolutely spectacular education from the high school. It was called Mendel CHS. It was named after Gregor Mendel. And when I got out, I had invitations to attend 9 different schools.
Wow. I went to Catholic school myself, and I found that the education there was superior in my own opinion. You told me a little bit previously about touring the Chicago on the public transit system.
Yeah, as a child we could get a bus pass, which meant that we paid half the normal fare. And so for 13 cents I could go at one point from 119th Street South all the way down to the center of State Street downtown. And then if I decided I wanted to go to the north end of the city, the same pass would take me 13 cents all the way to the north, and I could go from the north end all the way across to the south end.
Plus, Chicago has all those great things like the Art Institute, the Museum of Natural History. We toured all that, my wife and I did years ago, and it's a fascinating place.
Yeah, and I love the Museum of Science and Industry, and I became a lifelong member of the U-501 Club because I had been in the submarine so many times.
Oh.
Just absolutely fascinated by submarines.
Plus great music in Chicago. I've gone to most of the blues clubs there, and really good stuff.
Yeah.
Once you got out of high school, you started college at junior college and then went to Illinois State.
Correct. And I was there for 2 solid years. So I was into my 3rd year, and without all the details, I ended up being out of school at the end of June of 1966, which meant that my deferment as a student was gone.
Right.
So I went to work for a company that produced the selector switches for the M16A1 and 2. The company was called Casting Engineers, and I thought that would prevent me from being in the Army. Well, it didn't.
So you were drafted?
Yes, I was.
And you were drafted, the end of January of 1967?
Correct. Yeah, 31 January, I went to Fort Campbell, went through basic training there.
Fort Campbell, Kentucky?
Correct.
Home of the 101st Airborne?
Yes, and because of a series of mistakes, the Army was supposed to have sent me to the East Coast, but they sent me instead to the West Coast, to Fort Lewis, Washington, where I went through platoon leader school, and I found out that at 138 pounds, I could give commands. I could bark orders to people and they would pay attention. So the Army in its infinite wisdom sent me back to Fort Campbell, where I went through jump school, and then in a moment of stupidity, I agreed to go through Ranger School, which was in Fort Stewart, Georgia.
Okay. That's going to be way overtrained for your MOS, but you know, it's fun stuff. I have to admit that.
Yes.
So then, after Fort Stewart, you're going to go to Fort Eustis, right?
Yeah, and that's where I should have been instead
Virginia.
of, yeah. And
Virginia.
as it turns out, I went to Fort Eustis and was trained as a transportation movements control specialist, better known in the Army as a box humper.
Yeah.
We were in logistics, and my first assignment was was Sharp Army Depot in California near Stockton.
Right.
And I got there, and there was no job assignment for my MOS for some reason.
I mean, the Army didn't plan that out very well.
No.
Funny.
Which is how I ended up going to the base newspaper and said, well, you know, I don't have a job, but I'm a skilled photographer, and don't you have assignments for me? And they said no. So they sent me to the photo lab guy, and he was a civilian, and I begged him to find something for me to do so I wouldn't have to be on KP or guard duty. So he trained me to operate still cameras, motion picture cameras, and be a lab technician so I could process both motion picture and still photo film, which then allowed me to get a different military occupational specialty. So I became a photographer in 84B10, and then because I had some writing background, the officer I reported to made me into a military journalist. And that's, as you'll see in a moment, what leads me to what I do in Vietnam.
That's a very cool MOS. I mean, I have to admit, your first one, that was kind of uncool. But this thing, that sounds pretty sexy.
Well, it was the era where we had the speed graphic, the old 4x5 box cameras where you had a slide and a sheet film. And he had Leica cameras, the 35 millimeters, and then he had a Hasselblad 2.25. And he loved cameras.
Those are great cameras.
And this man trained me how to do everything with those cameras, and that led me to what it is I ended up doing in Vietnam itself.
Well, you sound kind of like a technical guy who would learn something like that pretty easily and master it.
Well, it was either that or else pick up cigarette butts or get shot at. So I thought, well, if I'm a photo guy, I won't really be in the field and people won't be shooting at me. So there was another great decision on my part.
So from there, in late February of 1968, you're sent to Vietnam.
Correct. Yeah, I'm sent to 90th Replacement Battalion at Ben Hoa, and from there, I've been in country 2 days, and a jeep full of guys show up from Ninth Infantry, and they call me out of the rotation and say, "Are you this guy, Pacholik?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "Are you a photographer?" And I said, "Yes, still in motion picture." And they said, "Good, you're going with us because our guy got killed yesterday, so you're a new photographer."
Combat photographer. That sounds good.
Yeah.
So you took off with the 9th Infantry to Chilan, which connects to Saigon.
Right, the
and
Chinese
was being
district.
run over by the
VC.
VC at that time.
Yeah, and I actually stayed with them for 4.5 weeks and did about, I would say, maybe 300 photos still. And then I had a cameraman who was assigned to us, and then he and I coordinated. So he'd shoot the film and I'd write the story, and then if I had stills, then I'd write. I'd either take the pictures or write it, or take the pictures, then go back and write it. But that's what I ended up doing, and we stayed with them for 4.5 weeks.
And the 4th day that you were taking photographs, what happened?
Well, that's a sign of age. I was 21 years old. I wore glasses. I'm left-handed. My ear stuck out. And I came around the corner of a building in Cholan, and I had a camera hanging off this shoulder, and I went to raise the camera up, and I got to about here, and a round hit the camera, and the camera exploded in my hands. So it showered me with shrapnel across. And here's the part that I think is fun. I took off my helmet to protect the film.
Well, you know, that's commendable. I have to say that.
I saved four frames.
Yeah. So you said you're using still cameras, and typically when you're with infantry unit, you were taking 60 to 70 photos a day. Or actually, even when you're doing logistical stuff, you were doing that.
Yeah, as it turned out, later on in the story, I become attached to 1st Log Command, 1st Logistical Command, and they were responsible for equipment, food, fuel, water, ammunition, and replacements. And they had something like 420 sites all over the country.
Wow.
Where they supplied everything to every unit. So if you wanted a poncho liner, if you wanted a rifle, you wanted any of those things. And my functional job became taking logistical shots, and then when I was assigned to a unit, I could go with them and do whatever they did as long as I came back and then did my logistical pictures.
And you developed somewhat of a reputation going out and taking a lot of these photos, so you're called into the Major General's office and he says, here's what you're going to do. What?
Yes, man's name was Thomas Heiser, and he was 2-star general. He was 1st Log Command. He was the smartest human being I have ever met. And he looked at me and said, son, you have a way with pictures, and I want pictures for 1st Log Command. You can take anything you want, but I want 20 to 50 pictures from you every day as long as you're in country. Well, he's a 2-star general. I'm an E4, and I said, yes, sir. And he said, so I want you to start a unit, staff it up, and get back to me when you're ready to go. And I said, well, where do I get the men? And he goes, I don't know, find some. And I said, where do I get the lab? And he goes, I don't know, find some. Anything else? And I said, no, sir.
Well, you know, if you could use his name, that might have been entree to a lot of stuff.
That's exactly what I did. I asked for a letter of authorization, and I went to something called Inventory Control Vietnam, and I pillaged the place until I found 4 stray guys that had no background at all, but I could train. And I found a photo lab, and I installed it, and then we ordered Wallensack recorders and cameras, and I started training these guys, and we were in the field 2 weeks afterwards.
So there were cameramen and sound men and both stills and moving pictures.
Right. And that's what we did. I trained them as still camera guys, and I said, just, you know, find people and get an action sequence and don't cut their heads off. And, you know, and they said, well, what happens if I do a bad shot? And I said, the Army has 500 million rolls of film. Don't worry about it. Shoot as many shots as you need and get as many pictures as interest you. And I found one of the best cameramen I have ever seen. He was an absolute natural, and he was an heir to the Macy's department store fortune, and he was an enlisted man.
It's nice to hear that all rich kids didn't avoid Vietnam.
Nope, he did not.
You worked for both a general and a major, who was major. You were actually working directly for this major.
Yes. Man's name was E.P. Vandevander. He was from Maryland. He was the finest staff officer I had ever worked with, and he was one of the most capable leaders. He took our unit and said, well, why aren't you guys going here or there? And we said, well, sir, we don't have authorization. He goes, well, I'll give you authorization, but I want you to go get some stuff. And if, as you may see later, 1st Logistical Command put out 2 magazines, and we contributed nearly 300 pictures for those 2 magazines. And I also did photos for 1st Aviation, 9th Infantry, 5th Special, and 25th. So we did all kinds of pictures in logistics, and then when the combat operation took place, we'd go out with them, we'd stay with them, we'd sleep in the mud, and we got some fabulous pictures.
Now the 5th Special Forces, that's a fine outfit. You had a little spooky kind of job with them. Tell us about that.
Well, without going on forever, I was assigned to join them in Laos, which was a neutral country, and we weren't supposed to be there. But I was tasked to take infrared film of the still, not motion picture, but stills of infrared of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so the Green Beret group, the A-team that took me in was 6 guys who were just absolutely spectacular. They were so skilled. And at one point, we were within 200 yards of a line of trucks.
On the Ho Chi Minh.
On the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And we were there, we were in 3 different places, and I think I took 12 or 15 rolls of film. And as soon as the film, I didn't process it, as soon as the film was done and we went back to our location, Army Security Agency people took it and I never saw what I shot.
And this is using infrared film and... Yeah.
At distances of maybe 200 yards, 200 meters maybe.
On another occasion, you went into one of the hottest areas in Vietnam, the Shau Valley, with the 101st?
Yes. I was tasked to do a number of pictures about support supply and logistics, but this was I was in early May, and I went in with them, and they had assigned me to C Company 1st Battalion 501st of the 101st. And normally, combat people didn't like us. They didn't want anything to do with us. They wouldn't give us food or water. They wouldn't help us because
they just lumped you as press.
Yeah, and I was Army. I was military. And these guys decided I was a jerk, and therefore they liked me. So they gave me some C rations, and I got them some recording tape, and so we became buddies. And when you read about the Shau Valley and the 101st, the main story was Hill 937, which became Hamburger Hill. In my case, I was attached to a support unit that was supporting the 2nd Battalion of the 506th, I think, on Hill 916. So it's an adjacent hill to 937. So I was not on Hamburger, but I was on an adjacent hill, and 506th was tasked to go from the mountain down into the ridge line, cut off the Vietnamese escape, and then go up one side of Hamburger. And as it turned out, it took them 3.5 days because the Vietnamese they pulverized both of us, both the 101st on Hamburger and us. Mortars and RPGs and tanglefoot and booby traps and just everything imaginable. And I was terrified.
In fact, there's a film called Hamburger Hill, which a lot of my friends who were in Vietnam, or even those in 101st, say they thought it's the most truthful sort of depiction of what serious combat was like.
And there's also a new book out called The Crouching Beast by a lieutenant who was on Hamburger Hill and survived. And it's phenomenal.
You decide to extend for another year. What are you, crazy, or what's going on here?
Well, I'm in the Army, so I can't get sent to Vietnam. I'm already there. And I've seen most of what I can do, and I pretty much understand what my job is. And by the time I have 6 men working for me, I'm responsible to keep everything going. So if they come in and somebody has to process the film or make the contact sheets or print the film, I'm good with the camera and I'm good in the darkroom. So I thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? So I extended for 6 months, and then I got notice that I was going to be reassigned after the 6 months to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And I was going to be attached to some infantry unit in some training brigade. And I thought, I'll stay in Vietnam for 6 more months.
I was at Fort Jackson for basic and for AIT, and in my case, AIT stood for Advanced Infantry Training, not Advanced Individual, because we just got more guns and fired more different types of weapons. But wasn't the most lovely place to be, I have to admit that. Close to Myrtle Beach, though, which if you got any time off, it was okay.
Yeah.
Now, you got into some trouble because of some of your photos.
Yeah, when I was with the 101st, which was in May of '69, I took probably 2 rolls of film of the 506th, and many of them were graphic photographs of wounded men and the misery of the men fighting on the hill. Some of it was motion picture, and some of it was still. But I kept 2 still cameras with me, one with a 200 millimeter, and the other was a wide-angle, a fisheye lens. And I got some really fabulous pictures. And I took one picture in particular of a man who was being carried down the hill, who's been blinded by shrapnel from an RPG. And it was one of those situations where I took the picture, I just instinctively raised the camera, took the shot, got the guy's name, wrote it on the back of the envelope that I carried in this waterproof bag in my fatigues, and I didn't think of it. And then when I went back and developed the film, the picture was the most striking picture I had ever taken.
In fact, we're going to show that picture in this video.
Sure.
So.
And long story, what happened was the lieutenant I reported to, not the major who I worked for, he gave me permission to release the picture. And I released the picture to the media, CBS, ABC, NBC, Time, and all. And the colonel I reported to was so enraged that he pulled me out of the unit and reassigned me to another assignment where I was responsible for offloading ships. It was a terminal service company. And for whatever reason, the lieutenant and then a captain in that company decided that I was a bad actor, and they just pounced on me and made the last 90 or so days of the Army absolutely misery. I think I was on KB duty probably 36 or 37 times. And I, at one point, was charged with disobedience because I hadn't trimmed the edges of my mustache. And they charged me with something called an Article 15, which is a disciplinary action. And rather than accept the Article 15, I chose and requested a summary court-martial. And I went through the court-martial, and I destroyed their arguments against me because I had photographic evidence of my mustache before I got the order and after. And the officer in charge of the court-martial was from the 196th Light Infantry, a lieutenant colonel, and he was absolutely outraged that he had been pulled in to sit through this trial. And it was bogus. They were after me, they wanted to pounce on me, and I put all 3 of the people involved, including my lieutenant, and I'm not a lawyer, but I had read the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and I pulverized their story, and I beat them. And so the last 15 days in the Army, I was picking up cigarette butts and guarding an empty latrine.
Well, it's too bad your service had to end like that.
Well, that's life.
You came back from Vietnam when?
December of 1969, and
Okay.
I was discharged through Oakland Army Terminal on 11 December 1969. They gave me a uniform, and the bus took me to San Francisco Airport.
And you came out of Vietnam with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Medal for Valor.
Bronze Star, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there was a helicopter crash that I was involved in, but I wasn't badly wounded. But there was a guy who was still in the ship, and part of the ship, the aviation gas started on fire. So it wasn't something that was phenomenal. I just ran over, grabbed him, and dragged him. I probably hurt the guy worse than I did. But
You probably would have died if
well,
you stayed in there.
But the one thing I can say, the men who served there, it didn't matter if they liked or didn't like you, they would protect each other, they would save each other.
Sure.
And I want to make 2 points. One, the man who dragged me out was a Chicano who didn't like me, and the man who saved my life, and this other man, was a black man. And I grew up in a section of Chicago where there was heavy racial bias against both of those 2 groups.
Right.
No more.
Well, good. So you're back in the USSA, and you're going to
I went back to Chicago. I stayed 30 days. It was colder than hell, and I couldn't live, so I took my duffel bag, a lamp, and a 1965 Corvair, and I drove west to California.
And you came to Sacramento in 1970.
Yeah, I actually went to work for three newspapers down in Turlock. The Turlock Daily Journal owned 3 small weeklies, and I ran that for a year. And then I applied to go to college at Sacramento State, and they accepted me. And so I came up to Sacramento, and I went to work for a newspaper in Roseville, and went to work and went to school for 6 years.
Wow. And you became a teacher, a professor?
Yeah, I finished the bachelor's degree, I finished the master's degree, I got a community college teaching credential, and then later on I got a secondary teaching credential in English language arts and United States history. And I'm a military history bug, so I have probably 1,000 books on all of this.
And you're married and have 2 children?
Yep. I am retired, my wife is retired, my children are grown, I have a cat. Cat loves my work. I'm a writer.
Yeah. Well, Bob, I'd just like to thank you for your service.
Thank you.
It sounds like it was particularly tough, and you did the best of it.
Well, I want to point out something for the camera. This man was Special Forces.
Big
I
deal.
know who Special Forces were.
I also want to mention, getting away from that you've just about to release a book called Night Flares. Hold it up for the camera.
There it is.
And it's 6 Tales of Vietnam, and it's going to come out either this Sunday or Monday.
Yes.
And
it's a paperback, and I have an ebook on Amazon as well of the same book.
Oh, terrific.
Thank you.
And I'd just like to say that concludes our time for Valley to Vietnam. I'd like to thank Bob and say welcome home to him and all the vets. For Valley to Vietnam producer Jerry Ward, director James Scott, I'm Bob Tribe, saying so long for now, and we'll see you next time.